The fluorescent lights of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport cast their harsh glow across Gate A7, where Harold Bennett stood patiently at the counter, his weathered hands resting on a simple black cane. At 87, his posture remained remarkably straight, a testament to his military bearing that decades of civilian life hadn't erased. In his left pocket, a small metal object pressed against his thigh, a reminder of why he was making this journey in the first place. "I'm sorry, sir, but your boarding pass seems to have an issue," the gate agent, Samantha, said, without looking up from her computer screen. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the keyboard, each click seeming to increase Harold's invisible burden. "You'll need to go back to the main ticketing counter to have this resolved." Harold glanced at his watch, a gift from his unit after the war, and felt his heart sink. The reunion was in 4 hours, and he'd already spent 45 minutes being shuttled between different airline staff members. "Miss," he began, his voice steady despite his growing concern. "I've already been to the ticketing counter twice. They assured me everything was in order." Samantha finally looked up, her expression a mixture of irritation and dismissal. "Sir, I can see here that your ticket was flagged for verification. There's nothing I can do at the gate. You'll need to—" "Young lady," Harold interrupted, something he rarely did. "I understand you have procedures to follow, but I'm a Korean War veteran trying to attend a reunion. Some of my brothers in arms won't be here next year for another chance. Surely there must be something you can do." The mention of his veteran status seemed to bounce off Samantha like rain off a windshield. "Sir, military service doesn't change airline policy. You'll need to—" "Is there a problem here?" The new voice belonged to a man in his early 40s wearing a well-tailored suit that seemed at odds with the casual attire of most travelers. Andrew Taylor had been observing the interaction for the past few minutes, his conscience increasingly troubled by what he was witnessing. "No problem," Samantha replied quickly, her tone shifting to something more professional. "I was just explaining to this gentleman that he needs to return to the main ticketing counter to resolve an issue with his boarding pass." Andrew noticed how Harold's hand instinctively moved to his left pocket, touching something there as if for reassurance. The gesture was subtle, but it caught Andrew's attention immediately. There was something about this elderly veteran's dignity in the face of bureaucratic indifference that struck a chord deep within him. "I've been trying to get this sorted for nearly an hour," Harold explained, his voice carrying no anger, only a weary patience. "I'm attending a reunion of my old unit from Korea. We're getting fewer each year, you understand. Time isn't as generous as it used to be." As Harold spoke, Andrew noticed other details: the way he stood despite clearly being tired, the precise manner in which his coat was buttoned, and most intriguingly, the way his hand kept returning to that pocket. Something about this man's bearing reminded Andrew of old photographs he'd seen in his grandfather's study. The gate area had grown quieter, other passengers unconsciously tuning in to the unfolding drama. A young mother had pulled her curious child closer, whispered something in his ear about respecting veterans. An elderly couple across the way shook their heads in disapproval at Samantha's treatment of Harold. "Sir," Samantha began again, but Andrew stepped forward. "Would you mind if I took a look at your boarding pass, sir?" he asked Harold, deliberately not revealing his position within the airline. Sometimes, he found, it was better to observe situations as they naturally unfolded. Harold handed over the crumpled paper, and as he did so, something metallic glinted as it shifted in his pocket. Andrew caught just a glimpse of what looked like aged silver or steel, but it was enough to heighten his curiosity further. As Andrew examined the boarding pass, he could see the issue immediately, a simple computer error that any supervisor could fix in seconds. But what troubled him more was how many employees had chosen to simply pass the problem along rather than take the time to help a veteran in need. The overhead speakers crackled with announcements, passengers rushed past, pulling their rolling luggage, but at Gate A7, time seemed to have slowed down, creating a small pocket of tension that would soon transform into something none of them could have anticipated. Andrew Taylor hadn't planned to be at Gate A7 that morning. As owner of Taylor Aviation, he made it a habit to periodically walk through his airline's terminals incognito, observing the day-to-day operations from a passenger's perspective. But something about Harold Bennett's situation had drawn him in, awakening memories of conversations with his grandfather years ago. "Mr. Bennett," Andrew said, still maintaining his cover as a fellow passenger. "Would you mind telling me about your unit while we sort this out?" He gestured to a nearby seating area, noting how Harold's hand once again moved to his pocket. Harold settled into one of the seats, his movements precise despite his age. "2nd Infantry Division, 23rd Regiment," he said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "We were at Chip-Yong-Ni in 51. Nasty business that was." Andrew's heart skipped a beat. Chip-Yong-Ni. He'd heard that name countless times during his childhood. His grandfather, James Taylor, had served in the same battle. The coincidence seemed too perfect to ignore. "The Chinese had us surrounded," Harold continued, his eyes taking on a distant look. 17 battalions against our regiment. The snow was deep that February, temperatures well below zero. We'd been fighting for days with little rest. As Harold spoke, his hand moved once again to his pocket, and this time he withdrew the object that had caught Andrew's attention. It was a silver lighter, tarnished with age, with distinctive markings etched into its surface. "This old thing," Harold said, noticing Andrew's interest, "saved my life and another young lieutenant's that night. We were running low on ammunition. Radio was spotty at best. This lighter helped us signal a relief column through the darkness. The lieutenant insisted I keep it, said it was a small price to pay for his life." Andrew's hands trembled slightly as he processed what he was hearing. His grandfather had told him this story dozens of times, about the veteran who had saved his life during the Battle of Chip-Yong-Ni, about a silver lighter used to signal through the darkness. "The lieutenant," Andrew said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was his name James Taylor?" Harold's eyes widened, really looking at Andrew for the first time. "Yes? Yes, it was. How could you know that?" Around them, the airport continued its constant motion, but Andrew and Harold sat in their own bubble of discovered connection. Samantha, still at the counter, watched the interaction with growing curiosity, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "James Taylor was my grandfather," Andrew said, emotion thick in his voice. "He passed away 5 years ago, but he never forgot about that night. He told me the story of the silver lighter and the brave sergeant who saved his life countless times throughout my childhood." Harold's weathered hands gripped the lighter tightly. "James, he made it home then? Had a family?" "He did," Andrew replied, fighting back tears. "He named his first son Harold after you. That's my father's name. Grandfather said he owed everything, his life, his family, all of it, to a sergeant who knew how to think quickly in the darkness." The revelation hung between them, decades of unknown connection suddenly bridging the gap between past and present. Samantha had abandoned any pretense of work, watching the scene unfold with growing understanding of her earlier mistake. Harold smiled, a warm, genuine expression that seemed to erase years from his face. "I've carried this lighter to every reunion," he said. "Sometimes I wondered if James made it home, if he had a good life. We lost touch after the war, as so many of us did." Andrew reached into his suit jacket and withdrew his business card, finally revealing his identity. "Mr. Bennett, I'm not just a fellow passenger. I'm Andrew Taylor, owner of Taylor Aviation. And thanks to you, I exist at all." The silver lighter caught the fluorescent airport lighting as Harold turned it over in his hands, each scratch and dent on its surface a testament to the history it carried. Around them, the bustle of Gate A7 had quieted, as if the space itself recognized the gravity of the moment unfolding. "Your grandfather," Harold began, his fingers tracing the worn engravings on the lighter's surface. "He was one of the bravest men I ever met, not because he didn't feel fear, we all did, but because he kept his wit about him even in the darkest moments." Andrew leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the lighter. He'd heard his grandfather's stories about it countless times, but seeing it in person, feeling its presence in this unexpected moment, made those bedtime tales suddenly, startlingly real. The lighter bore an inscription, faded but still legible. "To Lieutenant J.T. Keep your light burning. HQ 1950. Harold noticed Andrew studying it and smiled. HQ was Harry Quinn, my commanding officer. He gave this to your grandfather when he earned his commission. The night of the battle, James passed it to me, saying it had brought him luck and might do the same for us all. Samantha had moved closer, her earlier administrative strictness forgotten in the pull of the unfolding story. Other passengers, too, had drawn near, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The Chinese forces had surrounded us completely, Harold continued, his voice taking on the quiet intensity of someone revisiting a memory that had never fully left him. We were running low on ammunition, our radio equipment was failing in the cold, and we knew that if help didn't come soon, we'd be overrun by morning. He clicked the lighter open, then closed it, a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. Your grandfather had been separated from his platoon during a particularly heavy assault. He found his way to my position, and together we realized we needed to find a way to signal our location to the relief column we hoped was coming. The lighter's silver surface reflected the airport lights, creating dancing patterns on Harold's weathered hands. We were in a valley, you see. The Chinese held the high ground, and any obvious signal would have given away our position. But James, your grandfather, he remembered something from his Boy Scout days about using Morse code with light signals. Andrew nodded, the story matching perfectly with the version he'd heard throughout his childhood. His grandfather had always emphasized how the idea had come to him like a gift from heaven, a memory surfacing precisely when it was needed most. We found a sheltered position, Harold went on, and used this lighter to send our coordinates in Morse code. Short flashes, carefully timed. We could hear the Chinese patrols passing nearby, but in the darkness, the brief flickers of light were hardly noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look and what to look for. He passed the lighter to Andrew, who took it with reverent care. The metal was warm from Harold's hands, and Andrew could feel its weight, not just physical but historical as he held it. 3 hours we sat there, repeating the signal. Your grandfather's hands were so cold he could barely work the lighter, but he refused to stop. "Keep signaling," he kept saying. "Someone will see it. Someone will come." Harold's voice grew husky with emotion. And someone did. Just before dawn, we heard the rumble of friendly tanks. The relief column had seen our signals and used them to pinpoint our location. They broke through the Chinese lines exactly where we needed them. The lighter had more scratches on one side, and Harold pointed them out. Those came from that night. We had to crawl through some rocky terrain to get to our signaling position. James insisted I keep the lighter afterward, said it had served its purpose with him, and now it belonged with the story. Andrew ran his thumb over the scratches, feeling the physical evidence of that desperate night. The lighter was no longer just a prop in his grandfather's stories. It was a tangible piece of history, a bridge between past and present, between the young lieutenant his grandfather had been and the old sergeant who stood before him now. Andrew Taylor had walked through his airports hundreds of times, observing operations from a carefully maintained distance. It was his way of staying connected to the day-to-day reality of his business, of seeing how his employees interacted with passengers when they didn't know the owner was watching. But never had one of these walks led him to such a profound connection with his own history. Standing now at Gate 7, watching Harold carefully return the lighter to his pocket, Andrew felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one veteran being inconvenienced by airline bureaucracy. It was about how time and systems could make us forget the human stories that shaped our world. Samantha stood nearby, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by a complex mix of emotions playing across her face. She had been trained in procedures and protocols, in the efficient processing of hundreds of passengers each day. But nowhere in that training had there been a chapter about the weight of history that some travelers carried with them. "Mr. Bennett," Andrew said, finally breaking the reverent silence that had fallen over their corner of the gate area. "I'd like to do more than just fix your boarding pass issue. Would you allow me to hear more of your story?" Harold looked up, surprised by the request. "More of the story? Son, you've already been more than kind, and I don't want to keep you from your own travels." Andrew smiled, reaching for his phone. "I'm not traveling today, Mr. Bennett, and I think it's time I revealed something else to you." He pulled up a photo on his phone. an old black-and-white image he kept always with him, a picture of his grandfather in his military uniform. Harold's eyes widened as he saw the photograph. "Good Lord," he whispered, "that's James, exactly as I remember him." Same confident smile, same look in his eyes. Around them, the airport continued its endless rhythm of announcements and movements, but their corner remained somehow separate, a pocket of connection in the midst of transit. "My grandfather spoke often about the war," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "But he always said that the real story wasn't about the battles. It was about the bonds formed between people who looked out for each other when everything else was falling apart." Samantha had moved closer again, her curiosity evident. Other staff members had noticed something unusual happening and had drawn near as well, creating an impromptu audience for this unexpected reunion. "Your grandfather," Harold said, looking at the photo. "He wrote to me once, right after the war. I had been transferred to a different unit and we lost touch after that. The letter talked about his plans for the future, how he wanted to go into business, maybe start something in aviation." He looked up at Andrew suddenly. Taylor Aviation. That was his dream, wasn't it? Andrew nodded, fighting back tears. He built it from the ground up, started with one small charter plane, grew it bit by bit. He always said his experience in Korea taught him the importance of connecting people, of bringing them home safely. The revelation seemed to strike Harold deeply. He looked around the gate area, seeing it with new eyes. "So his dream lived on," he said softly. "It more than lived on. It thrived." Andrew watched emotions play across the veteran's face, and in that moment he made a decision that would change not just Harold's day, but the future of Taylor Aviation itself. The story of the Silver Lighter and the Battle of Chipyong-ni wasn't just a tale from the past. It was a lesson about humanity that his airline had somewhere along the way forgotten. The gathered crowd at Gate 7 had grown quietly respectful, forming a loose circle around Harold and Andrew. The regular bustle of airport life continued around them, but here, in this modest corner of the terminal, time seemed to move at its own pace, allowing space for memories and connections to unfold. "There's something else you should see," Andrew said, his fingers moving swiftly across his phone's screen. He pulled up another photograph, this one newer, showing an elegant office with a glass display case. Inside the case, mounted prominently, was a military medal. "My grandfather kept this in his office until the day he retired. He said it reminded him of the night that changed everything." Harold leaned forward, his eyes widening in recognition. "The Korean Service Medal," he breathed. "James received it for his actions that night at Chipyong-ni. I was there when they presented it to him." Samantha, still hovering nearby, couldn't help but interject. "Was that from the same night as the lighter?" she asked, her earlier administrative detachment completely forgotten in the pull of the unfolding story. "Indeed it was," Harold replied, his voice taking on the tone of a natural storyteller. "You see, after we successfully signaled the relief column, we weren't done. James, Lieutenant Taylor, insisted on going back out. We had intelligence that suggested there were still wounded men from his platoon out there." Andrew had heard fragments of this part of the story from his grandfather, but never the full account. He settled into his seat, aware that he was about to hear a piece of his family history that had perhaps never been fully told. "The relief column had broken through," Harold continued, "but the Chinese forces were still active in pockets throughout the area. The temperature had dropped even further, and we could hear sporadic gunfire in the distance. Most men would have taken that moment to rest, to recover from the hours of tension. But not James." Harold's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket where the lighter rested. "He came to me with a map and said, 'Sergeant, I know where they are. I can't leave them out there.' I tried to talk him out of it. We were exhausted, cold, and the situation was still dangerous. But he looked at me with those determined eyes of his and said something I've never forgotten. The measure of our humanity isn't what we do when it's easy, but what we choose to do when it's hardest." A young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, is this a real war story?" The mother nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "So we went out," Harold said, his voice growing softer, forcing everyone to lean in slightly. Use that same lighter to check our map in brief flashes. We found 3 wounded men from his platoon, all of them barely conscious from the cold. James gave them his own coat, his gloves. We carried them back one at a time. Andrew pulled out his handkerchief, dabbing at his eyes. He never told this part of the story in detail, he said. He always skipped to the end, saying only that good men made it home that night. Your grandfather was modest about his own actions, Harold replied. The medal citation mentioned the rescue, but it couldn't capture the real courage it took. Not just physical bravery, but the moral courage to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. A passing flight attendant had stopped to listen, her drink service cart momentarily forgotten. The story seemed to be weaving a spell over everyone within earshot, transforming a mundane airport gate into a place where past and present merged. The next morning, Harold continued, when things had finally calmed down, James came to me. He was shivering. He still hadn't replaced the coat he'd given to one of his wounded men. He pressed the lighter into my hand and said, "Keep this. It's seen us through the darkest night, and sometimes we need reminders that light always returns." The revelation of their shared history demanded context, and Andrew found himself drawn deeper into the story of Chipyong-ni, a battle that had shaped not only his family's destiny, but the lives of countless others. The airport gate had become an unlikely classroom, with Harold's memories bringing history vividly to life. February 1951 was a crucial time in the war, Harold explained, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as he settled into the role of historian. The Chinese had entered the conflict in force, pushing United Nations forces back from the Yalu River. Chipyong-ni was a vital railway junction, holding it was essential to preventing a complete withdrawal from Central Korea. Andrew noticed how the other passengers had stopped checking their phones, caught up in the unfolding history lesson. Even the gate agents had paused their work, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Your grandfather's unit, like mine, was part of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, Harold continued. We were surrounded by an entire Chinese division, roughly 25,000 men against our 5,000. The odds were, well, let's say they weren't in our favor. He paused, reaching again for the lighter in his pocket, as if drawing strength from its presence. The weather was our enemy as much as the Chinese forces. Temperatures dropped to well below 0 at night. Our weapons would freeze up. Simple tasks became nearly impossible with numbed fingers. But the cold also proved our ally in some ways. It forced the Chinese to light fires at night, revealing their positions. Samantha had pulled out a small notebook and was actually taking notes, her earlier bureaucratic demeanor transformed by genuine interest. "How long were you surrounded?" she asked. 3 days and 3 nights, Harold replied. But it felt like an eternity. Time moves differently when you're counting ammunition and wondering if each patrol might be your last. James, Lieutenant Taylor, he kept our spirits up. He had a way about him, a quiet confidence that made you believe we'd make it through. Andrew listened intently, connecting these details with the fragments of stories he'd heard throughout his childhood. His grandfather had never presented himself as a hero, always emphasizing the collective effort, the brotherhood that emerged in those desperate hours. The Chinese would attack in waves, Harold continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. They'd blow bugles and horns, psychological warfare, trying to unnerve us. But your grandfather would joke about it, say they were just announcing dinner time. He had a way of finding humor even in the darkest moments. A flight attendant who had been listening asked, "How did you maintain hope in such conditions?" Harold smiled, a warm expression that seemed to bridge the decades. Hope comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a young lieutenant who refuses to leave his men behind. Sometimes it's a simple silver lighter that helps guide rescuers through the darkness, but mostly, it's the knowledge that you're not alone, that the person next to you in that foxhole is willing to lay down his life for you, and you for him. Andrew noticed how the crowd had grown completely silent, hanging on every word. This wasn't just a history lesson. It was a testament to the human spirit, a reminder of the bonds that form in the crucible of shared adversity. "You know," Harold said, turning to Andrew, Your grandfather never saw himself as special. After the war, when he started building Taylor Aviation, he wrote to me once. Said he was trying to create something that would bring people together, make the world a little smaller and friendlier. Looking around this airport now, I'd say he succeeded. Andrew Taylor sat in contemplative silence for a moment, his father's namesake before him, the weight of generations of gratitude pressing on his heart. The bustling airport terminal continued its rhythmic flow of humanity around them. But here at Gate 7, something profound was transforming not just a moment, but an entire company's future. "Mr. Bennett," Andrew finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of decision. "I've spent years running this airline, focusing on efficiency, protocols, and procedures. We've won awards for on-time performance and customer satisfaction. But sitting here, hearing your story, I realize we've lost something far more valuable along the way." Harold tilted his head slightly, curious. The silver lighter in his pocket seemed to carry a new weight now, as if its significance had somehow grown in the telling of its story. "When my grandfather started Taylor Aviation," Andrew continued, rising from his seat and beginning to pace thoughtfully, "he didn't just want to move people from point A to point B. He wanted to create connections, to bring humanity to the skies. Somewhere along the way in our pursuit of corporate excellence, we've forgotten that every passenger carries their own story." Samantha, still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, her earlier treatment of Harold weighing heavily on her conscience. But Andrew's next words weren't about blame. They were about transformation. "You see, Mr. Bennett, when my grandfather saved those medals, when he built this company, he was doing more than preserving memories or building a business. He was creating a legacy of service, of human connection. Today, you've helped me remember that." Other airline staff had gathered around, drawn by the intensity of the moment. Andrew turned to address them all, his voice carrying the passion of renewed purpose. "Each day, thousands of people pass through our terminals. Veterans like Mr. Bennett, families reuniting, people pursuing dreams or saying final goodbyes. Each one carries their own silver lighter, their own story of courage, loss, hope, or love. Our true mission isn't just to transport them, it's to honor their journeys." Harold watched as Andrew's words began to affect the gathered staff. He saw shoulders straighten, expressions soften, eyes brighten with understanding. The transformation wasn't just happening in Andrew. It was rippling outward, touching everyone within reach. "When my grandfather passed away," Andrew continued, emotion thick in his voice, "his last words to me were about legacy. Not the airline's profit margins or market share, but about what we stand for. He said, 'Andy, remember that every time someone trusts us with their journey, they're trusting us with their story.'" He turned back to Harold, his decision crystallizing into purpose. "Mr. Bennett, your story, your connection to my grandfather, to this company's very foundations, it's not just a coincidence, it's a reminder, a call to return to our roots." The gathered crowd watched as Andrew pulled out his phone, beginning to type rapidly. "Right here, right now, we're going to start something new, or rather something old made new again. We're going to create a program that honors not just veterans, but the human spirit that connects us all." Harold's eyes misted as he watched the grandson of his old friend transform from corporate executive to visionary before his eyes. The silver lighter in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if acknowledging this moment of rebirth. The transformation of an idea into action began right there at Gate 7, with Andrew Taylor standing before his impromptu audience of staff and passengers. His fingers flew across his phone's screen as he dictated a series of emails that would reshape Taylor Aviation's approach to customer service. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of both owner and visionary. "We're launching Honor Flight, not just a program, but a complete reimagining of how we serve our passengers, starting with our veterans." Samantha, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up with interest as Andrew began outlining the specifics of the program. This wasn't just a corporate initiative. It was a revolution in airline service born from a chance encounter and a silver lighter's story. "First," Andrew detailed. Priority boarding for all veterans, not as a courtesy, but as a recognition of their service. They've spent enough time waiting in their lives. He paused, looking at Harold. But it goes deeper than that. Every member of our staff will be trained in military culture and history, understanding the significance of different service periods and experiences. The gathered airline staff listened intently as Andrew continued. We'll create a dedicated service desk in every terminal staffed by veterans themselves. They'll understand the unique needs and experiences of our service members in a way no training manual could teach. Harold watched with quiet amazement as his difficult morning transformed into a catalyst for systemic change. The silver lighter in his pocket, once a symbol of past courage, was now lighting the way to future transformation. But this isn't just about veterans, Andrew emphasized, his vision expanding as he spoke. Every passenger has a story. Every journey has meaning. We're going to create a culture that honors that. Our gate agents will be empowered to listen to make decisions that put human needs first. He turned to Samantha, whose earlier interaction with Harold had sparked this revolution. We're not going to focus on who made mistakes. Instead, we're going to learn from this moment. Every staff member will be trained to look beyond the boarding pass, to see the person holding it. The program details flowed from Andrew as if they had been waiting years to emerge. Special lounges for veterans and their families, partnership programs with veterans organizations, staff training in military history and protocol, recognition ceremonies for veteran passengers, a storytelling initiative to capture and share veterans' experiences, community outreach programs connecting veterans with schools, priority assistance for disabled veterans, memorial displays in major terminals honoring service members. As Andrew outlined each element, Harold noticed something remarkable happening among the staff. Their postures changed, their expressions shifted from polite attention to genuine engagement. This wasn't just another corporate program. It was a mission that resonated with their own values. We'll start implementation today, Andrew declared, right here at Seattle-Tacoma. Mr. Bennett, if you'll allow us, we'd like you to be the first honored passenger of the program. Your story, your connection to our company's history, makes you the perfect person to help us launch this initiative. Harold stood, his military bearing automatic even after all these years. I'd be honored, he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. Samantha stepped forward, her earlier embarrassment transformed into determination. Mr. Taylor, she said, I'd like to volunteer to help coordinate the staff training program. I think my experience today has taught me something valuable about the difference between following procedures and honoring people. Andrew nodded, appreciating the sincerity in her voice. That's exactly the kind of transformation we're looking for. This program isn't just about changing policies. It's about changing hearts and minds. The silver lighter in Harold's pocket caught the light as he shifted, sending a brief flash across the terminal, a final salute to the past as it helped birth the future. The impact of Andrew's announcement rippled through Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with remarkable speed. Within hours, the story of Harold Bennett, the silver lighter, and the birth of the Honor Flight program had spread through every terminal, touching hearts and transforming mindsets along the way. Samantha, who had started her day enforcing rules with rigid precision, found herself at the center of an impromptu training session with her fellow gate agents. The conference room near Gate A7 had quickly become a command center for immediate change. When Mr. Bennett first approached my counter, she began, her voice carrying the weight of learned wisdom, I saw a problem to be solved according to procedure. Now I understand I was looking at everything except what mattered most, the person standing in front of me. The other gate agents leaned forward, recognition dawning in their eyes. Many had faced similar situations, caught between protocol and humanity, never quite sure which should take precedence. You know what really got me? Samantha continued, emotion catching in her throat. When Mr. Taylor revealed who he was, he didn't focus on my mistake. Instead, he showed how we could all be part of something bigger. That's the kind of change I want to be part of. In another corner of the terminal, a young flight attendant named Maria was already implementing changes in her own way. She had been part of the crowd at Gate A7 and had immediately called her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran, after her shift. Abuelo, she had said, tears in her eyes. "I finally understand why you keep that old compass in your pocket. Some things we carry aren't just things. They're bridges to who we are, who we've been, and who we want to be." The maintenance crew, having heard the story, took it upon themselves to begin planning a special display case for the terminal. Joe Martinez, the head of maintenance and a veteran himself, sketched out plans for a wall of honor that would showcase military memorabilia and tell veteran stories. "We can put it right here," he explained to his team, pointing to a well-trafficked area near the main security checkpoint. "Every passenger who passes through will see it. Every veteran will know they're not just passing through. They're coming home." Even the airport's retail spaces caught the spirit of transformation. Sarah Chen, manager of the terminal's largest bookstore, immediately began reorganizing her displays to feature military history and veterans' memoirs more prominently. "Books are bridges too," she explained to her staff as they worked. "They connect us to experiences we haven't lived, help us understand sacrifices we haven't made. Every veteran who passes through here should see that their stories matter." The TSA officers, often viewed as the most inflexible part of the airport experience, found their own way to participate. James Wilson, a supervisor and former Marine, gathered his team for an impromptu meeting. "Starting today," he announced, "we're going to learn the proper greeting for every branch of service. When we check a veteran's ID, we're going to acknowledge their service appropriately. Security doesn't have to mean losing our humanity." Back at Gate 7, Andrew watched these changes unfold with quiet satisfaction. Harold sat beside him, the silver lighter now resting on the armrest between them, its surface catching the afternoon sun. "You know," Harold mused, "your grandfather would be proud, not just of the program, but of how you're implementing it. He always said the true measure of leadership isn't in making rules, it's in inspiring hearts." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the terminal windows as Andrew Taylor prepared for what he considered the most important moment in his company's recent history. The gate area had been transformed in just a few hours. Maintenance crews had worked with remarkable efficiency to install a temporary stage and presentation area. Word had spread throughout the airport and a substantial crowd had gathered. Airline staff from other gates, passengers waiting for various flights, airport employees from every department, all drawn by the story that had been circulating since morning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andrew began, standing at the makeshift podium, "today marks not just a new initiative for Taylor Aviation, but a return to our foundational values. Values that were forged in the darkness of a Korean night, when a silver lighter became a beacon of hope." Harold sat in the front row, his posture military straight despite his age. The silver lighter rested in his hand, gleaming under the terminal lights. "My grandfather, James Taylor, built this airline on a promise to connect people, to honor their journeys, to recognize that every passenger carries their own precious cargo of hopes, dreams, and memories. Today, we renew that promise." Andrew gestured toward the large screen behind him, which flickered to life, showing an image of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner in Taylor Aviation livery. But this aircraft was different. Its tail bore a distinctive new design. "This is the first of our new fleet of honor aircraft," Andrew announced, "and I'm proud to announce that it will bear the name Spirit of Harold Bennett, in recognition not just of one man's courage, but of all those who serve, who sacrifice, who carry their own silver lighters as tokens of duty and memory." A gasp rippled through the crowd as the image zoomed in to show the aircraft's name painted in dignified letters along its fuselage. Harold's hand tightened around the lighter, his eyes brightening with unshed tears. "But this is more than just a name on an airplane," Andrew continued. "Each of our honor aircraft will carry a special plaque in its forward cabin, telling the story of its namesake. Passengers will learn about Harold Bennett, about Chip Yong-ni, about a silver lighter that guided heroes home in the darkness." The screen changed to show interior shots of the aircraft, including a specially designed display case near the forward cabin door. Within it, a replica of Harold's lighter would be permanently displayed, along with photographs and the story of that fateful night. "Furthermore," Andrew announced, his voice carrying the weight of purpose, This aircraft will be dedicated to a special mission within our fleet. It will serve primarily on routes carrying veterans to reunions, ceremonies, and memorial events. Its crew will be specially trained in military protocol and history. He turned to Harold, extending his hand. "Mr. Bennett, would you do us the honor of coming forward?" Harold rose, straight and proud, and made his way to the podium. The silver lighter caught the light as he moved, sending brief flashes across the gathered faces. "This lighter," Andrew said, gesturing to the precious object in Harold's hand, "guided brave men home in darkness. Now its story will continue to light the way for new generations. We've had a replica made, not to replace the original, but to carry its legacy forward." An airline employee stepped forward, carrying a velvet box. Inside lay a perfect replica of Harold's lighter, but with an addition. Engraved on its surface were the words, "Spirit of Harold Bennett, lighting the way home." "This replica will fly with the aircraft that bears your name," Andrew explained, "while your original remains with you, carrying its precious memories. Each time this aircraft takes to the sky, it will carry not just passengers, but a story of courage, connection, and the enduring power of human dignity." The crowd erupted in applause, but Harold's response was simple and profound. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the letter James Taylor had sent him all those years ago. "I think," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its age, "it's time this came home too. Your grandfather wrote about his dream for this airline. Today, you've made that dream even bigger than he imagined. Te ayudaré a desarrollar las partes finales 11 y 12 de la historia, llevando la narrativa a su conclusión." 3 months after that transformative day at Gate 7, Harold Bennett stood in the central atrium of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, marveling at how much had changed. The once sterile space had been transformed into what employees now affectionately called Heritage Hall. A grand display case dominated the central wall, its polished glass housing not just military memorabilia, but stories of human connection. At its center, a photograph showed Harold and Andrew on that fateful day, the silver lighter between them catching the light. Around it, other stories had begun to accumulate, each one a testament to the ripple effects of that single moment of recognition. "Mr. Bennett," called a familiar voice. Samantha approached, but she was different now. The stiff, protocol-bound gate agent had been replaced by a confident woman wearing a new badge that identified her as Veterans Services Coordinator. "I wanted you to see this," she said, leading Harold to a newly installed interactive kiosk. The screen displayed the Honor Flight Chronicles, a growing digital archive of veterans' stories collected from passengers passing through the airport. "Since we launched the program," Samantha explained, pride evident in her voice, "we've collected over 1,000 stories. Each one helps our staff understand the real meaning of service and sacrifice. But more importantly, each story helps us remember that every passenger carries their own precious cargo of memories." Harold watched as the screen displayed various narratives: a Vietnam veteran reuniting with his unit, a young soldier returning home to meet his newborn child, an elderly couple making their final journey to a memorial service. Each story was treated with dignity, respect, and understanding. The impact of the Honor Flight program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Taylor Aviation's customer satisfaction scores had soared, but more meaningful were the letters and emails that poured in daily, sharing stories of how the airline's new approach had touched lives. "You know what's remarkable?" Samantha continued, gesturing around the terminal. "It's not just about veterans anymore. The program taught us to look for the human story in every interaction. Last week we had a passenger who missed her connection because her mother was in the hospital. Before, we would have just rebooked her by procedure. Now, our staff arranged priority booking and made sure she had access to our laptop station to update her family." Harold nodded, understanding. The silver lighter in his pocket, his original, not the replica that now flew with his namesake aircraft, seemed to warm at the thought. What had begun as a moment of potential conflict had bloomed into a movement of compassion. Andrew Taylor appeared, walking with a group of airline executives who were visiting to study the program's success. He broke away from the group, when he spotted Harold. Perfect timing, Andrew smiled. I wanted to show you something. He led Harold and Samantha to a new addition to the Heritage Hall, a beautifully crafted book bound in blue leather. This is the first copy of Silver Linings: The Taylor Aviation Story, Andrew explained, opening the volume to reveal photographs, letters, and stories. We're giving one to every employee and placing them in all our lounges, but this copy is special. He turned to a page where a familiar piece of paper had been carefully preserved behind archival glass, the letter James Taylor had written to Harold all those years ago. Your story, that silver lighter, they're not just part of our company's history now, Andrew said softly. They're our compass, guiding us toward what an airline can and should be. 1 year to the day after Harold Bennett's fateful encounter at Gate A7, a special ceremony was taking place in the Heritage Hall of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The space was filled with airline staff, veterans, and regular passengers, all gathered to witness something extraordinary. Harold stood at the podium, his bearing still military straight despite the passing year. Beside him, Andrew Taylor beamed with pride as his friend and mentor addressed the crowd. The silver lighter, the original, rested on the podium between them, its surface catching the morning light streaming through the terminal's windows. A year ago, Harold began, his voice strong and clear. I walked into this airport feeling like a stranger, just another passenger to be processed through the system. Today, I stand here surrounded by family. Not by blood, but by something just as powerful. Shared purpose and understanding. He gestured to the Heritage Hall around them, where thousands of stories now lived in photographs, artifacts, and digital displays. The space had become a living museum of human connection, each exhibit a testament to the power of seeing the person behind the passenger. The spirit of Harold Bennett has completed 362 flights this past year, Harold continued, referring to his namesake aircraft. But more important than the miles flown are the stories carried. Each passenger who steps aboard learns about a night in Korea, when a small light helped guide heroes home. They learn that sometimes the smallest gestures, taking time to listen, showing respect, extending kindness, can light the way for others. Andrew stepped forward, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. Today we're not just celebrating the success of a program, he announced. We're celebrating a transformation in how we see our mission. Every Taylor Aviation employee now carries this reminder. He held up what looked like a business card, but it was actually a miniature version of James Taylor's letter to Harold, laminated and carried by every staff member. On its reverse was the company's new motto, "Every passenger carries a story. Every journey matters." Samantha, now the head of the expanded Veteran Services Department, stepped forward with a surprise. "Mr. Bennett, Mr. Taylor, we have something to show you." The large screen behind them illuminated, showing live feeds from airports across the country. In each one, a heritage hall had been established, each with its own unique collection of stories, but all sharing the same spirit of recognition and respect. The ripple effect continues, Samantha explained. Other airlines have begun similar programs. The FAA is developing new guidelines for veteran services, but more importantly, people are remembering to see each other as human beings first, not just passengers or staff or numbers. Harold reached for the silver lighter, holding it up so it caught the light. "This lighter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "once helped guide brave men home through darkness. Today, its story continues to light the way toward something just as important, the recognition of our shared humanity." Andrew took the podium for the final announcement. Starting today, Taylor Aviation is establishing the Bennett Scholarship for Aviation Service. Each year, we'll select veterans or their children who wish to pursue careers in aviation, because the best way to honor a legacy is to ensure it continues to grow and shine. As the crowd applauded, Harold looked around at what his simple silver lighter had helped create. The terminal was no longer just a place of transit. It had become a space of transformation, where every journey was recognized as sacred, every story honored as significant. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver lighter one more time. Its flash seemed to signal the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a reminder that the best stories never truly end. They just light the way for new ones to begin. In the distance, a jet engine roared to life. The spirit of Harold Bennett was preparing for another flight, carrying not just passengers, but a precious cargo of stories, memories, and the eternal flame of human dignity. And in Heritage Hall, the legacy of a silver lighter continued to shine, reminding all who passed through that in the darkest nights, a small light can guide the way home.